We may say that of all these three kinds of satisfaction, that of taste and the beautiful is alone a disinterested and free satisfaction. For no interest, either of sense or of reason, here forces our assent. Hence we may say of satisfaction that it is related in the three aforesaid cases to inclination, to favor, or to reverence. Now favor is the only free satisfaction. An object of inclination, and one that is proposed to our desire by a law of reason, leave us no freedom in forming for ourselves anywhere an object of pleasure. All interest presupposes or generates a want, and, as the determining ground of assent, it leaves the judgment about the object no longer free. Immanuel Kant. As I explained previously, the judgment that something is beautiful, like all judgments, can be explained according to four moments, Kant says. I talked about those in my lecture on the table of judgments. All judgments, according to him, have a quantity, a quality, a relation, and a modality. And I already talked about the quantity of the judgment about beauty in my last lecture, in the lecture on taste. And I said that it is a quite curious thing, because while as a logical judgment, so a judgment of cognition, a judgment that says that some object, let's say a flower, has a certain predicate, in this case the predicate of beauty, as a logical judgment, it is of course a singular judgment. I'm just saying this flower is beautiful. And as a logical judgment, it is a judgment a posteriori. I need to first experience, to first see that flower before I can know that it has this predicate of beauty. But as an aesthetical judgment, so a judgment about pleasure and displeasure, it is in fact a universal judgment. By calling something beautiful, I'm not just saying that it brings pleasure to me, that I like looking at it, but rather I am stating that it will bring pleasure to everyone. And this is not something I know from experience, obviously. I haven't asked other people before whether they like this beautiful thing or not. I sort of assume that they will. And that means it is a synthetic judgment a priori. And as I said, of course, there will not be actual agreement between every single human being that a specific thing is beautiful. But still, when I call it beautiful, I say that there should be agreement. And I will say that everyone who doesn't agree with me has no taste. Taste to Kant was the ability of our power of judgment to pick that which is liked not just by me, but which is liked generally or universally even. But the other three moments of the judgment on what is beautiful remain. I talked about what is taste, but I didn't really talk about what beauty as such is. So let's get into that. And let's start with the quality. What quality does beauty have? Well, Kant says that usually when we have a sort of pleasure, and beauty brings a sort of pleasure to us, usually it comes with an interest of ours. And the pleasure comes with that interest being fulfilled. And interest to Kant means wanting the reality of a certain object. So it's not enough to have a representation of that object in our mind. Rather, what we want is that object to have actual reality, right? So It's not enough for me to just imagine a tasty cake. I want that cake to be real. And I don't want it to just be real somewhere on this earth, but I want it to be real in my mouth. Otherwise, it won't bring pleasure to me. And Kant says there are two types of interest, or two ways in which this can work. Because one possibility is that pleasure comes before the interest. And that is the case with sense pleasure. I refer you back to my lecture on pleasure and displeasure, where I talked about the three different types of pleasure. And the sense pleasure, the pleasure that Kant calls delight in the pleasant, here I first experience pleasure, and that is what gives me an interest. Like, let's go with food. Before you have tasted a certain food, you don't know if it will taste good or bad to you. So you don't know if it will bring you pleasure, and therefore you have no real interest in it. But let's say you try a food that you haven't tried before, and you find that it is very tasty. So now you will have an interest in eating that food again. So that is the case in sense pleasure. The pleasure always comes first, and then the interest develops out of that, which is why Kant calls it pathological pleasure. And nowadays, when we hear that something is pathological, we tend to think of sickness somehow. But actually, pathos is just the Greek word for passion, and the adjective, so pathological, is just the Greek word for the Latin adjective passive. So what Kant means here is that this interest is an interest where we are passive, where we are sort of victims and not perpetrators. We don't decide to have this interest. Like, I don't decide to like this food, or I don't decide to like women or to like men. We just sort of are given this interest by our nature. But there's also the other possibility that interest comes before pleasure, and we don't get the interest because we find that something brings us pleasure, but rather because we take an interest in something, we derive pleasure from it. And that is the case when it comes to the intellectual pleasure. So, to that which, again, I talked about this in my lecture on pleasure and displeasure, to that which Kant calls the approval of the good. So let's go with the immediate good. Let's go with the moral good here. Let's say that I hear the news that suddenly there's world peace. All wars have been ended. All conflict parties have agreed with one another. Or let's say I hear that world hunger was defeated. I will get pleasure from that. Of course, not sense pleasure, like from good food or from sex or whatever, but intellectual pleasure. I will be happy about it. But that happiness is not, it will not cause an interest, right? It's not just that I hear peace has broken out, and before that I had no interest in peace, but now I find that I'm happy about this news that there's peace, and therefore from now on I want peace. But rather it's the other way around. I want there to be peace on earth, and because I have this interest, when it is fulfilled, when peace becomes real, I will approve of that. I will be happy about that. So in that way, this is an interest I take myself. So I will only get pleasure from that if I already have the interest. Like if I'm not a good person, if I'm an evil person and I don't care about people dying in war, then I won't care about that news. It won't bring me any sort of pleasure. And to be sure, this is not just true for the moral good, but also for intellectual pleasure that is about what Kant calls the immediate good, the useful. So let's say I want to cut something and I'm given a knife which is very sharp and it is easy to cut with that knife. I will be happy about having a tool which makes me reach my goal, and I will approve of that. But again, this happiness, this sort of pleasure, is something I will only experience if I already have taken an interest in cutting something. If I don't want to cut something, then I don't care about having a sharp knife. It won't make me particularly happy to get one. So that is why Kant calls this sort of interest not pathological, but practical interest. Because here it is not that we get an interest or we are given, so to say, by nature an interest, but rather Kant says here we take an interest in something. And those are the two possibilities when it comes to pleasure and interest. Either in sense pleasure, the interest is pathological, that is, it is passive because the pleasure comes first and the interest develops out of that, or it is an active interest in intellectual pleasure, that is, the interest comes first. We actively take it, and that is why we get pleasure when that interest is met and realized. And I will add that, of course, nowadays the reigning ideology is that there basically is only pathological interest. There is no such thing as us actively taking an interest in something. Even when it seems that way, it is still nature driving us. So nowadays, many will try to explain even morality as a sort of pathological interest. So they will say, oh, when you are moral, that is based on compassion, and that of course is passive, right? So you just like you taste food and you find that it tastes good, and so you want more of it. Here you see people suffering, and you find that that hurts you too because you have compassion, and so you want to end that suffering. And to that, I would say that as far as compassion goes, this is true. And Kant would agree with it. He would agree that compassion is pathological, and if you have an interest in ending people's suffering because you have compassion with them, that is a pathological interest. But for that very reason, it is not moral, and compassion cannot be a good basis for morality. I will talk more about that when I get to Kant's moral philosophy in some weeks. But that would mean that a good person is just a victim of his own compassion, and he didn't choose that compassion. So he cannot now be applauded for doing something good when really he was just following his nature. I mean, he didn't choose his compassion any more than you choose being heterosexual or homosexual. It's just the way you are. And that means if someone else did not have compassion, if someone else had a cold and uncaring heart, or even was cruel and sadistic maybe, and did not just not care, but even took pleasure in others' suffering, you could not blame such a person either. Because just like the compassionate person, that's just how they are, that's just their nature. And this would mean that if we go with the materialistic ideology of our time, which says that humans are just animals, they are just victims of their nature, of their sensuality. There is no such thing as free will, and therefore you cannot take an interest in something. If we go with that, if you seriously want to go with that, then there is no morality. It would mean that the person who helps others and who tries ending their suffering because he feels compassion is really no better morally than the person who kills someone because he feels hate, or the person who rapes someone because he feels sexual desire. I mean, even if someone raped a child because he was a pedophile, he didn't choose to be a pedophile. That's just how he is. Just like the other person didn't choose to be compassionate. That's just how he is. So, if you really wanted to believe that there's only pathological interest, then one of them is not better or worse than the other. Of course, morally speaking. I mean, you could still say that the compassionate person has a better effect on his fellow human beings than the murderer or the rapist. But just because the murderer or the rapist causes suffering, that would not mean that he is morally evil and that he can be blamed. I mean, a tornado causes suffering and causes people to die, and of course that can be devastating. But we don't blame the tornado. We don't say that the tornado is an evil person, because it's just nature which killed people here. And well, the same would be true if there was only pathological interest driving all our actions. And it would also mean that there was no such thing as moral duty. So maybe you are compassionate and you want to end other people's suffering, but maybe I don't care. I don't care that they suffer. Now, you could not tell me, but it is your duty to help them. And if you don't help them, you are an evil person. You cannot tell me that if all morality is based on compassion. Because in that case, I could reply, well, you feel compassion and okay, so act on your compassion and try to help others, but I don't feel compassion. In fact, maybe I feel sadism. So just like you are acting on your feeling, I will act on my feeling and cause suffering, just like you try to help those who suffer. Where's the difference? So, and this is a position that no one really takes. Like even the ausgeklärt relativists, who totally will claim that humans are just animals and humans are passive, there is no free will, there is only pathological interest. Even they will not take this position. Even they will be usually quite disgusted and horrified if someone were to take that position. But that is just inconsistent, which is always the mark of unaufklärtness. The unaufklärt people are always inconsistent. And often they are horrified or they get very angry if you just take their principles. And remember, I explained in the lecture on what is reason that thinking according to principles is exactly what rational thinking means. If you just take their principles and think them through, if you just state what would follow by necessity from their principles, and if you don't like what follows, then the only option you really have if you want to be taken seriously and if you want to be a rational being is get rid of your principles and adopt other principles. Which is also why I, as a philosopher, feel somewhat annoyed by people still demanding that the philosopher, whether it's me or someone else, um, disproves this position that there is no free will and all morality is just based on compassion, because it's not a position that anyone actually seriously holds in all its consistency. So point me to one single person who really sticks to that position, and then maybe I will have a conversation with that person and try to argue with that person. But I never quite got why I should waste my time disproving a position that no one seriously holds anyways. But let's go back to Kant and to the quality of the judgment about the beautiful. So usually when we have pleasure, it is connected with an interest. Either when it comes to sense pleasure, the pleasure comes before the interest, and the interest is born out of the pleasure, or when it comes to intellectual pleasure, the pleasure is born out of the interest, and we ourselves take an interest in something. Well, when it comes to the pleasure that beauty gives us, Kant says neither is the case. There is no interest, in fact. It is a pleasure that is merely contemplative. So I just contemplate the beautiful, I just view it and find pleasure in that without having an interest in it, without wanting anything from it. And that is because when it comes to beauty, I take pleasure in the representation itself. So in the, so to say, image I have in my mind. When it comes to the other two kinds of pleasure, that is not enough. I don't just want to hallucinate or to dream, let's say, that there's a tasty cake, or in the case of sense pleasure, or let's say in the case of intellectual pleasure, that there's world peace. In fact, not only is the dream, if I know that it is a dream, not satisfying for me, when I find out that it was a dream, that might even cause me displeasure. Like if I had a dream about eating tasty food, or I had a wet dream about having hot sex, but also if I had a dream about world peace, or about world hunger ending, and now I wake up and I realize it was just a dream, quite opposed to giving me pleasure, this will probably cause me displeasure. I will probably be disappointed, and the dream, once I realize it was a dream, will just have reminded me of what I would want, but I don't have. But when it comes to the beautiful, it doesn't really matter if, let's say, the beautiful flower that I enjoy, if it is real or if it is just an imagined flower. As long as the hallucination or the dream or whatever is sufficiently clear. So as long as the image is just as strong as if I looked at a real flower, what do I care when it just comes to beauty? Because it is precisely that image which is beautiful. I don't need the object of my representation to be real. To be sure, Kant is aware that many people, more, let's say, primitive minded people, can only enjoy something which maybe ought to be beautiful if it has some sort of appeal. That means if it speaks to their interest, and usually their pathological interest. So they can only enjoy maybe a beautiful woman, but not a beautiful flower, because when it comes to the woman, there's also sexual attraction involved. This is very apparent when it comes to art. especially nowadays. You have lots of art that people don't look at because it's beautiful, but because it appeals on some level to them. Like you have very loud music that is there to steer up your senses or your emotions, but isn't necessarily beautiful. Or you have movies that are very fast paced and full of explosions and quips and witticisms and splatter and blood and gore and full of shocking twists and full of sex and I mean you have shows where you see boobs in every episode and clearly people are not watching this because it is beautiful, because it is actual art, but rather they are watching this because it somehow appeals to them. Like it's exciting. It's like a roller coaster ride when something new happens all the time, and when there are always shocking twists and subverted expectations, or when there are sex scenes and boobs all the time. It's basically a softcore porn, and you find that such people um, maybe they will watch such movies and shows, but for example, books are too boring to them. They have no taste for this kind of art because it doesn't appeal to them. But of course, even when it comes to books, I don't want to say that all books are higher arts, but here too, you have people who read books just for the excitement, just because there are shocking twists once again, or once again because it's softcore porn. I mean, you have all these discontent housewives or longing teenage girls who just read those books about the exciting vampire or billionaire or mafia boss um, having some sort of BDSM relationship with some sort of completely insignificant woman. Um, but Kant would say that if you need this sort of appeal to appreciate something, to appreciate a work of art, for example, that always shows a severe lack of taste. Because actual taste for the actual beautiful is not about having an interest. Quite the opposite. The beautiful is that which I like, which gives me pleasure, without it speaking to some sort of interest of mine. And someone might be inclined to disagree with that because, um, well, because of the way we use the word beautiful um, in everyday language, because we often mix it up with other things, especially when it comes to people. Like many would call a person beautiful. Let's say they say this woman is beautiful because they find her sexually appealing. But I mean, that is the usual mark of everyday language, that it is unclear and doesn't really reflect on its words and doesn't really distinguish them properly, but mixes them together. Kant would say here that often when people say, "Oh, this woman is beautiful," um, they don't mean that she is beautiful. I mean, maybe she is, maybe she isn't, but that's not the point. Often what they mean is she is hot, she is sexy, she is attractive. I mean, we have lots of words for that. We don't need to misuse the word beauty here. Um, of course, someone could be attractive and beautiful at the same time. They don't contradict each other outright, but they are just not the same thing. And I think you can realize that when you when you reflect about other instances where you might use the word beautiful. Because sure, you can say this woman is beautiful um, when actually you find her sexy, but maybe you can also appreciate that this man is beautiful. even if you're not into men. Or you can say that this is a beautiful old person, like this is a beautiful grandma. Or you can say this is a beautiful child, without it meaning sexual attraction. And I mean, sure, in those cases, there are at least some people who are sexually attracted to old people or to children. But we use the word beautiful also in instances where there's no one who would mean it to describe sexual attraction. Like we will say that a flower is beautiful, or that a sunset is beautiful. And okay, I mean, to be sure, there are all sorts of perversions and fetishes, but at least I have not yet heard of anyone wanting to fuck a sunset. So clearly, when we say that something is beautiful, we don't really mean that it is sexually attractive. We mean something else. But what this shows is that there is a problem when it comes to judging the beautiful. Kant says there is a pure aesthetic judgment, which would be when we just judge about beauty, and when something just gives us pleasure because it is beautiful, so it just gives us pleasure in pure contemplation without any sort of interest mixed in. But very often you have what Kant calls an empirical or an applied aesthetical judgment. And that means that you are not judging beauty alone, even if maybe you think you are, but rather some sort of interest of yours, some sort of pathological interest might be mixed in. So that is why Kant would say that it is very hard to judge the beauty of humans, because whether it's conscious or not, our sexuality and what we are sexually attracted to will probably be mixed in. So it is hard if I like women, it is hard to really look at a woman and completely abstract from all my sexual interests and just judge her beauty without judging her attractiveness at the same time. Indeed, Kant actually agrees with Winkelmann that women are not the fair sex, that actually the male body is more beautiful than the female body, and it is just because as men we have this mixed in attraction that women have a special appeal to us. And he's saying that as someone who certainly wasn't gay or wasn't blind to female attractiveness. Like there's a story that even as an old man he liked to look at the young fiancée of a friend's son and to have her sit close to him at the table. But still, his point is, if it wasn't for our sexual attraction, we actually wouldn't like the female form so much. But even when it comes to human beings without our sexuality getting in the way of judging them, like I'm not into men, but still I might have a hard time judging the beauty of a man, because there are other factors as well, of course, like for example sympathy. If you like someone, his facial features might seem more friendly to you, more likable, and therefore you might find him more beautiful than he is. While if you dislike someone, if you hate someone, you maybe can't stand to look at his face, and maybe you will find him more ugly than he actually is. But also when it comes to non-human things, we usually have only applied aesthetical judgments, not pure ones. So for example, when you find a flower beautiful, Kant would say, is it really the flower that is so beautiful? Or is it actually that you like the smell that the flower gives off, and the pleasure that we get from the smell, um, that has nothing to do with beauty? I mean, again, our language is muddled up there. We might say the flower smells beautifully, but here Kant would say no, this belongs to sense pleasure, right? Um, this is delight in the pleasant we take, not a liking of the beautiful. So when you like the smell of the flower, um, it might make the flower seem more beautiful to you than it actually is. That's why Kant actually says that a picture of a flower might be easier to judge in terms of the flower's beauty um, than an actual flower in front of you, which gives off a smell. But even when it comes to things that can't appeal to our senses directly, like let's say you're judging the beauty of a rainbow or of a sunset, even here some sort of interest might get mixed in, at least unconsciously. Like maybe you say the sunset is beautiful because it actually is beautiful, but maybe it steers up some unconscious thoughts of yours about, let's say, romanticism. Like um, the sunset in our society, in our culture, is so loaded. Um, Maybe when you see a beautiful sunset, you unconsciously imagine yourself not watching it alone, but watching it together with a loved person, holding hands, and so on. And that makes the sunset more appealing to you than it otherwise would be, maybe. Um, or maybe when you find something beautiful, like let's say you say this evening is beautiful, maybe it just, even if unconsciously, reminds you of a cherished childhood memory. Maybe it reminds you of a similar evening when you had a good time with other people, and that is why now this evening is appealing to you. So pretty much always there might be some interest mixed in, some memory, some association of yours, and therefore you probably are not making a pure aesthetical judgment. You're probably not judging completely without interest. And of course, this goes for not just positive interest, so where you want something, but also negative interest, not wanting something. This can also distort your judgment. Um, I'm reminded I had a talk with a Syrian refugee when I think like must have been like 9 years ago, so I'm getting old, I guess. Um, so at the time, I used to teach German to refugees, and this Syrian refugee came from the countryside, and we talked about animals, and I mentioned mice being my favorite animal, and he couldn't get that at all. He was disgusted by mice. He said, "You mice, how can you like mice?" Um, and he couldn't appreciate the beauty of these cute little animals. But even back then, that immediately made sense to me, um, because, of course, we came from completely different backgrounds, completely different ways of living. I mean, me here in the city, in a modern society, um, mice don't threaten me. But he knew mice only as pests that actually threaten you, that actually threaten your food. So he had a negative interest in mice. He wanted to get rid of them. I don't have, if you are raised here in the city, in modern society, you don't have a particular interest in mice one way or another. So it is easier for you to just contemplate them and to just judge their beauty. Likewise, I remember watching some documentary about a tribe in Africa, and they were asked about various animals, like the elephant, the dog, and it was striking to me how they just said, yeah, elephants, they are very dangerous, and dogs, they are very useful, they help you hunt. So they were only judging these animals in terms of their usefulness or how threatening they are. But of course, considering their lifestyle, that made perfect sense. So they could not look at elephants or dogs without interest, because they were just too closely tied to their interests. So you might be able to appreciate the beauty of an elephant, like nowadays here in our society, where we don't have a particular interest one way or another in elephants. Many would probably say elephants are beautiful animals, but you can appreciate the beauty of an elephant, or let's say of a lion, if you see them in a nature documentary or in a picture, or maybe in the zoo behind bars. But if you are standing in front of a stampeding elephant herd, or if you stand in front of a hungry lion and there's no bars between you, then maybe you will have a harder time looking at them without any interest of yours mixing in. And so, in that way, beauty and appreciating beauty is a sort of luxury. And Kant actually says as much. He says that first culture and then civilization must develop before we can really appreciate beauty. He says that the savage cannot really appreciate beauty yet. So, to be sure, with civilization, you don't just cultivate people's appreciation for beauty, but also civilization can distort and pervert it. This can happen through fashion, for example, and I already addressed that in the last lecture, the lecture on taste. When civilization puts in place a certain fashion, people don't ask anymore what is beautiful. That is, they don't judge with their taste anymore. They don't ask what could appeal to everyone without interest being mixed in, but rather they just judge, well, does it fit this fashion or not? And if you think of various fashions, like the powdered white wigs in Kant's day, like unnaturally small hips that you get through pressing yourself together through a corset, or like those unnaturally small feet that used to be considered beautiful in China, or as I mentioned in the last lecture, in my school days, the boys would form their hair into a sort of comb on the top of their head, or like young girls nowadays wearing these claws. I mean, you cannot call these plastic things, you cannot call them nails, they are claws. So when you consider fashion, it's quite apparent that there's nothing which would be so dumb or so ridiculous or so ugly that it could not be turned into a fashion, and that you could not brainwash people into actually liking it. But also, of course, civilization can distort the taste through ideology. So people can maybe dislike certain things for ideological reasons. Like I've met someone who could not appreciate a rainbow or the colors of a rainbow because he was so against gays. And of course, this is artificial, this dislike, in two ways even. Because for one, the connection between rainbows and gayness is completely artificial. I mean, there's nothing inherently gay about a rainbow. And in fact, it is a very, very recent thing, only a few decades old, and only here in our society that we started associating the rainbow with gays. For the longest time in human history and for most societies, no one would have thought of gays when thinking of a rainbow. And then, of course, this hatred for gays, that's also artificial. I mean, that is just something coming out of some ideology. So, for these two artificial reasons, he could now no longer appreciate rainbows. Or I've read people, I mean, if you think of the Quran is very, very beautiful. It is just very beautiful Arabic, and if you hear it recited, if you hear it sung, it just sounds very beautiful. And I know of people, however, who are so against Islam that in their anti-Semitism they cannot appreciate. They just cannot appreciate this beauty of the Quran. I mean, you should be able to abstract from whatever the content of those words may be and appreciate that they just sound beautiful, but there are people who will outright deny that or who will even get angry when you talk about the beauty of the Quran. And that is not a natural reaction. That is a reaction born from ideology. For all of those reasons, you rarely, if ever, have a pure aesthetical judgment. Usually you cannot be quite sure if you judge the beauty or also the ugliness of something, if really you are judging just the beauty, or if maybe some interests of yours, at least unconsciously, influence that judgment. And sometimes I hear that being used as a criticism of Kant's theory of beauty, like people saying, oh, but this beautiful that he talks about, that's not something that ever happens in real life. We never judge completely without interest. But that might be true, and Kant might have agreed with it, but I don't see how that disproves his definition of beauty. If we never judge without interest, and if beauty is that which pleases us without interest, it just means that we never appreciate something simply for being beautiful, but it doesn't make the definition of beauty wrong. That's quite similar to criticism against Kant's moral theory, and I will talk about that more in some weeks when I get to that. But there too, people sometimes say, oh, when Kant says that acting moral is just acting out of duty and duty alone, and if anything else, if any pathological interest is causing your action, like for example, if you act out of compassion, or if you help someone because he's your friend, then that is not a moral action. Then you have people saying, oh, but if you set the bar so high, then nothing is a moral action. And it might be true. It might be true that Kant sets the bar so high that there is no pure aesthetical judgment, nothing that purely is liked for its beauty, and that he sets the bar so high that there is no action that is just done out of moral duty. But there are still ideals that we can strive for and that we can try to get close to. And here what Kant is doing really is just what science generally is doing, not just philosophy. I mean, in order to understand something, it is useful to isolate that something from everything else, even if that is not, even if it is not isolated usually in actual reality. Like, for example, the chemist, he may talk about water. Um, what is water? What are the attributes of water? And here too, you could argue that, oh, this pure water he talks about, this pure H2O, that's not something you usually find in the world. If you look at raindrops or at a lake or at the sea, you never have just water. You always have other substances mixed into that water, like salt, for example, and therefore, of course, changing some of the attributes that water as such has, according to the chemist. Well, that is true. But that doesn't mean that what the chemist says about water as such is wrong, does it? And it can be useful, even if in reality you always have water mixed with other stuff, to isolate it from that and to look at what parts of the attributes of the water that we find in the world really come from it being water, and what part of its attributes are not necessary and don't come from it being water, but come from other substances mixed in. And the same is true here. It might be true that our aesthetical judgments are usually empirical aesthetical judgments, where at least to some degree appeal that something has to us, its appeal to some interest of ours, is mixed in. But it is still useful to isolate what actual beauty means and what parts of an aesthetical judgment, what attributes of such an aesthetical judgment belong to it being a judgment about beauty and not about just what appeals to my senses. And what Kant finds that way is that the judgment that something is beautiful is a free judgment. You need to be free here. It needs to be a disinterested, a non-partisan judgment. If you still need something appealing to your senses and steering up your emotions in order to enjoy it, that is the mark of a barbarian taste, Kant says. And in the last lecture on taste, I talked about how the barbarian is basically, it's not the savage in the 18th century. It's not synonymous with savage, so it's not someone who's brutal or completely uncultured, but it is someone who has no proper taste, whose taste was not cultivated or civilized. And actual taste means having a disinterested, non-partisan judgment, not mixing your interests in, but just judging if something, if you like something, in just viewing it, just contemplating it. And in that way, even though Kant doesn't outright say that it is connected to Aufklärung, like he talks about beauty in one text and about Aufklärung in completely other texts, but if you think about it, it is. Now, our age is very superficial, and so is the way we think about Aufklärung usually. Aufklärung is associated with rationality, being critical, free thinking, thinking for yourself. But people are not used to associating any of that with having taste for what is beautiful. But the thing is that Aufklärung doesn't just mean leaving the guidance, the leadership, the tutelage of other people. So not blindly believing whatever your pastor tells you or whatever the media tells you, or I don't know. But rather it also means leaving the leadership of your senses. not blindly being pulled and driven by your own senses, by your own desires. If you can only judge according to what you desire or don't desire, you are a victim, you are a prisoner, a slave of your own desires, of your own interests. If you become aufklärt, you rise above your senses, above your desires, and only then are you able to actually develop taste, to actually make a disinterested judgment about something's beauty. So in that sense, it is only aufklärt people who can truly appreciate beauty. I think if you think about it, and if you look around, if you look at yourself, if you look at people around you, you will indeed find that the more uncultivated someone is, the more unfree someone is, the more primitive someone is, the more selfish someone is, the less taste that person will have. I mean, just look at all the materialistic, hedonistic people. Like, look at the average influencer on Instagram or whatever. Their taste is ruled by whatever is fashionable or whatever is considered trendy or whatever. They will want clothes or cars or whatever based on brands. So it is not really about beauty. It is about status. It is about being able to pose with it on Instagram. Like, why would someone want, when it comes to cars, specifically a Porsche or a Lamborghini or whatever? Certainly not because just the way the car is designed, not because it just looks more beautiful than other cars. I mean, sometimes people will get completely tasteless cars, like a car which is completely golden, which doesn't look beautiful, but it is there to say, look at me, I have money and a small dick. And likewise, when you see these influencers go to Dubai, for example, I mean, that's a hell. I mean, that place is hell. There's nothing, absolutely nothing beautiful about that place. But clearly, it is not about beauty. Again, it is just about being able to pose for a picture, about being able to show off. It is just about your status. It is just about how society has loaded these things. Like, of course, you cannot just say that this is simply natural desire for sense pleasure either, because natural uncultivated sense pleasure, like if you took some tribesman from an isolated tribe, I don't think he would want to live in Dubai. I don't think he would care about those clothes or those cars of those people. So mere sense pleasure will be about food that tastes good or sex that feels good. This is already a desire for things that has been distorted by society, that has been distorted by the media, by socialization. But clearly, it is not something which is based on actual taste. Clearly, it is not about actual beauty, but about other things that are associated with these objects. Or likewise, look at unfree societies. Look at despotic states. You will always find that there is no beauty there. Quite the opposite. I mean, just look at the architecture, this brutal, crude architecture in North Korea. Or look at their propaganda pictures. Like, they are so cheesy, so campy, and so definitely not beautiful. Or look at the Near Eastern despotisms. Like, look at the Arabic oil states. Their building projects, they they are about gigantomania, but they are certainly not about creating beautiful architecture. And I mean, Arabs used to be able to create very beautiful architecture, um, but that was at a point in history when there was not such a crass despotism in those countries. As soon as freedom leaves, so does beauty. But also when you look at individual people, I want to give two anecdotes that have stuck in my head. Both have sort of shocked me at the time, and I will probably never forget them. Both are about former classmates of mine. So one was in elementary school. I was probably in first grade even. And we were on a trip, and there was a flower on the wayside, and I was enjoying looking at that flower. And there was this other boy who was like, "Ew, flowers! I hate flowers. Flowers are gay." And this boy was a little older than me. Maybe I think he was one grade above me, maybe two. And back then, I saw him as much older than me. But looking back, I mean, this was a kid. He was maybe 8 years old. He was just a little child. And what a poor child he was. He was one of the cool guys of the class. But again, we are talking about a maybe 8-year-old child. So he's playing at being cool, but really he's just a kid, right? And because he had to be cool, he could not look disinterestedly at a flower and just enjoy contemplating that flower and how beautiful it is, because he had this interest of his. He had to be cool, and cool boys don't enjoy flowers. They find flowers gay. And it should come as no surprise that this guy was also a massive bully. Because there's always this connection. These people who can't appreciate beauty, they are also not good people. They are not moral people. And I actually met this guy again some years ago. So when I was already in my 20s, uh, some evening around here in my area, I met him in the streets. He was hanging out and chilling with some buddies of his, and I'm saying buddies and not friends, because such people don't have friends, they have only buddies. And yeah, well, they were hanging out or chilling, which is basically a code word which means being bored together. And yeah, well, he approached me in the street and he asked if I wanted to buy weed. So that is apparently what became of him. He's selling drugs now. And again, this should come as no surprise. Such a person who really is a slave of his own interests, his very primitive interests, I might add, cannot. He really doesn't know that this is even a thing, that this is even a possibility. He cannot look at something without interest. The other story is another classmate of mine, this time from high school, and this guy, well, he didn't ever sell drugs. He just bought them and took them, and his life basically just revolved around drugs and girls, and otherwise was pretty much empty. And he too was not a moral person. Like, he was not such a bully at school. He, in his own way, actually was somewhat nice, but he just had no regard for other people. He was not being actively mean, or at least not trying to be mean, but he was not showing regard to other people. He was objectifying other people. You could especially see that in the way he treated his girls. Like, for example, he told me one time some girl um, was crushing on him, and he had her over at his place, and he took her virginity. And then afterwards, she wanted to cuddle, but he was basically done with her and had no further interest in her. So he just lied that his parents would come home soon and shouldn't find her. So he sent her off and then basically ghosted her. So this is the kind of guy he was. And again, he was not trying to actively be mean. Like, talking about it later, he would agree himself that he was being an asshole. But that didn't stop him from doing something like that again with the next girl. Because again, he was a slave of his interests, like in this case, his sexual desires, and he could not rise above them, which, of course, to be a moral person, you need to do. Having regard for other people means not just treating them as objects to get whatever you are interested in, like, for example, sex, but rather, having regard for their own freedom, for their own personality. But, anyways, the story here is that some evening, I met with him on a bridge, and Berlin has sometimes quite beautiful sunsets. And this evening we had a particularly beautiful sunset, maybe one of the most beautiful I've ever seen. And he was waiting for me. And when I came, he was just like, you are finally here, so let's go down into the subway and let's go where we wanted to go. And he couldn't understand, and he was quite annoyed with me, that I wanted to stay a few minutes and look at the sunset. I mean, it couldn't take more than a few minutes. It's not like a sunset takes forever till the sun is completely gone. But he was standing there on this bridge with this wonderful, splendid red sky above him, and he didn't spare one glance at the sky. But again, to me, this makes perfect sense, because a sunset is something you can neither smoke nor fuck. So it really was of no interest to him. And since he was a slave of interest, of pathological interest, that is, everything which did not appeal to his interests basically didn't exist to him. And that's exactly the kind of person who cannot appreciate beauty. The kind of person who is ruled over by his interests. You have to aufklären yourself, to rise above your interests in order to become someone who even can appreciate beauty. However, so as not to cause misunderstandings, let me stress that the beautiful is really something which we enjoy without any interest. Not just without pathological interest, but also without practical interest. So Kant makes a difference between what he calls free beauty or independent beauty and what he calls adhering or conditioned beauty. And he would say that when you have a thing, an object whose beauty you are judging, which also has a purpose, which is not so much true for the beauty of nature, but which is true for the beauty of objects that humans create. When that thing has a purpose, you have a concept of that thing, of what that thing is supposed to be, and you will always judge that thing according to this purpose it has. So let's say you have a house. You cannot just judge the beauty of a house without judging it as a house. And your concept of a house says that a house is there to be a building you can live in. So if the house has no proper roof, so rain can come in, it's not a good house. Or if the house is not properly isolated, so it gets very cold, it's not a good house. And then if it's not a good house, you will probably not find it fully beautiful. Or if you were judging the beauty of a ship is not just a beautiful object. It is first and foremost a vessel to get across the sea with. So you will judge it according to your concept. You will judge whether it is a good ship, and then you might also judge if it's a beautiful ship. But if you judge that it is not a good ship, if somehow it is a bad ship, if it is badly built so that it will probably sink immediately, then it will also not be beautiful. So 2 lectures ago, in the lecture on pleasure, I talked about how the objective dogmatic rationalism, which was the position taken by the Leibniz-Wolffian school in Kant's time, the position taken by someone like Baumgarten, basically reduced the pleasure we take in the beautiful to intellectual pleasure. How it basically said that we find things beautiful because we find them to be perfect. And in that lecture, I said that Kant disagrees because the perfection of an object can only be judged based on a concept of what that object is supposed to be. And then you can judge, is it perfect for its purpose or not? But actually, Kant doesn't disagree completely with this position of the Leibniz-Wolffian school. He would say that there are beautiful things which we can only really find beautiful if they are perfect, that is, if they serve their purpose. But this is then not free, not independent beauty. This is just adhering or conditioned beauty. This is exactly one reason why Kant prefers the beauty of nature over the beauty of man-made objects. They also can be beautiful, to be sure. They can even be very beautiful, but not quite to the same degree, Kant would say, as nature. Because when it comes to nature, there is no purpose necessarily. We don't necessarily have a concept of but this flower, this animal, this sunset, what it is supposed to be. We really just contemplate it without interest. While when it comes to objects that were created with a purpose, we have the practical interest that they should serve their purpose, and we make this intellectual judgment whether they are perfect for their purpose or not. And while that itself is not the judgment of beauty, as Baumgarten thought, still the beauty of the object depends on that judgment. It depends on its perfection. Just being perfect for its purpose doesn't make it beautiful. Like, something could be a good house or a good ship without also looking beautiful. But it is a condition that must be met, or otherwise it can't really be beautiful. To make a pure aesthetical judgment, to judge free, independent beauty, there should be no pathological interest of yours coming in, but also no practical interest. So it's best if it's not a man-made object that has a purpose, but just something out of nature. And that the quality of the judgment on beauty is that it is a disinterested judgment. This gives a first, albeit just negative explanation why it is a universal judgment, as I said in the last lecture on taste. so why its quantity is universal. Because if you think about it, any pleasure that in some way is connected to interest can only be felt by someone who happens to have that interest. So I might take pleasure in attractive women because I like women, but another guy might be gay, and so he finds no pleasure in women. He finds pleasure in men, which don't interest me. And likewise, I might take interest as a moral person in world peace, but someone else who is not moral might not care, might not take pleasure in that. So, in that sense, pleasure based on interest in some way or connected to interest cannot be universal. But since the pleasure in the beautiful is a disinterested one, it must be universal under the condition that you really look at something without interest. So this also at the same time explains why even though there should be universal agreement on what is beautiful, there often isn't. There isn't because most people, maybe all people to a degree, don't look at something completely disinterested, but they have their interests mixed in. Here, this really comes down to the important distinction Kant makes between the human being of appearance, the homo phenomenon, so the empirical individual, and there are different individuals, there are 8 billion of them, and the human being in itself, the homo noumenon. So just humanity as such, being human as such, not being this or that specific empirical human with these or that characteristics, but just being a human as such. If you want to get further into that, I talked about this distinction in the lecture on the apperception. Basically, if you judge something as an empirical human being, as a homo phenomenon, you have certain interests that another homo phenomenon does not have. So your judgments will probably be different. But if you rise above your individuality, and if you just judge as a human being as such, then everyone would have to make the same judgment. Precisely because we rose above our individuality, right? How could there be individual judgments when we are not judging as individuals? If we are judging just as human beings, then we would have to agree on what is beautiful or not. So if there was a country somewhere of completely wise people who all are completely selfless, who all rose above their individuality and who all abstracted from their sensual desires, from their pathological interests, they would all have the same taste. They would all have to agree on what is beautiful. But since there is no such country, you will usually not find agreement on what is beautiful. And I know some people listening to that will probably disagree without having a proper counter argument, but just because they will stubbornly stick to, this cliche that everyone has his own taste and that's just it. But that is unphilosophical. And that is also unaufklärt, because Aufklärung is about self-reflection. Proper science should not just accept things at face value. It should not just accept that people have different tastes, that some person finds this beautiful and another person finds that beautiful, but rather it needs to explain. Well, beauty is a thing, like as a phenomenon. We do find things beautiful. And so we need to explain what that means. what is it to find something beautiful? Why do we find something beautiful? And here I think Kant has found the right explanation, that it is a disinterested judgment, and therefore everyone would have to agree on what is beautiful. And when they disagree, then it means that the two people who disagree, at least one of them, probably both, is not truly making a disinterested contemplative judgment about the beauty of something, but rather he is basing his judgment on how it appeals to his senses, or whether it is perfect according to the concept he has of it. In either case, he's not judging about mere beauty. And if you wanted to disagree with Kant's theory, I don't see how you can justify beauty as a word existing. We don't need two words for one and the same thing. So we could just talk about the pleasant then. We could just say that which we call beautiful is pleasant, if it too is just something that appeals to our senses. If you want to justify there being two different words, then there needs to be a different quality. And I think Kant is right in saying that the quality of the beautiful is that we enjoy it without taking an interest in it. And that is exactly why it is helpful to isolate this aesthetical judgment, even if pure aesthetical judgments may not happen usually. As I said, just as it is helpful in chemistry to isolate water, even though usually in the world you don't have pure water. Because that way we find exactly that even though we probably usually don't judge completely without interest, some interest of ours might slither in, so to say. It is exactly this disinterested pleasure which we mean when talking about beauty. And that is exactly the reason why the judgment on the beautiful should be universal, but at the same time usually isn't. But with that, let's turn to what Kant says about the judgment on the beautiful according to its relation. Because, okay, fine, its quality is that it is a disinterested judgment, but how come that something can give pleasure to me if I have no interest in it? Why is it that I don't just not care about it one way or another if I have no interest in it? Well, Kant says it has to do with the purposiveness of the beautiful. We find something beautiful because, at least unconsciously, we find it purposive. What he means by that is, well, usually something is purposive if it serves its purpose well, right? And that is something that can be judged through a concept of the intellect. So if I have a certain purpose, let's say I'm sick, I want to get healthy again, then I will find medicine that actually heals me from this particular illness. I will find that to be purposive. And on the other hand, some superstitious moonshine ritual I will not find purposive because it actually doesn't lift that illness from me. Or if I, let's say, if it's cold outside, then I will probably find a warm pullover and a coat to be purposive. While if it's very hot summer outside, I will probably not want to wear them. So here you have a certain purpose, and purposive is that which actually serves that purpose. And again, you need a concept to judge that. But that is material purposiveness. Now, the thing with beauty is that here you don't have material objective purposiveness, so the beautiful is not actually serving a specific purpose, but there is a formal purposiveness in it. So think of something which may be beautiful without serving a function. Let's say some Tibetan mandala, or let's say some beautiful Arab ornaments in a medieval mosque. These things, I mean, they have no purpose as such, right? They are useless, but still we find a certain beauty in them, because they still in their form are purposive. So they are in a way formed as if they had a purpose, even though we can't name that purpose. If it was just random scribbling, we would not find that beautiful, because that would not just not have a purpose, but also not be formed in a purposive manner. Of course, both material and formal purposiveness can come together in the same object. That is again what you have in what I already called with Kant adhering or conditioned beauty. So let's say you have a knife. If you ask about its material purposiveness, I mean, the purpose of a knife is to cut something with it. And in order for it to be purposive in that sense, it needs to be sharp, because if it's a blunt knife, then it can't fulfill its purpose. And it also should have a hilt, because the sharpest knife is not a good knife if it's just a sharp blade, because then you will cut into your own hand while using it. So it should have a hilt. And that, being sharp, having a hilt, will make it a good purposive knife. Now, let's say the hilt had some beautiful engravings. These will not turn it into a better knife. But their mere form is beautiful because it is a purposive form. While on the other hand, if someone had just randomly scratched into it with another knife, we would not find these lines, these scratches, purposive in their form, and so we would not find them beautiful. If you go back to my lecture on sensuality and the forms of viewing, I said that to Kant a perception has two parts. Sensation, that is what we actually perceive through our senses, like red or warm or salty or whatever. And on the other hand, there is the form in which these sensations appear to us and in which they are connected. And the forms in which we view our sensations are always space and time. Those are the two forms of our viewing or intuition, as Kant says. Well, the sensations, they make the material of the perception. Its form in time and space is, well, its form. And therefore the sensations have nothing to do with beauty, Kant would say. They have everything to do with sense pleasure, with the delight and the pleasant, right? So I could say that the sensations I get from something, like the taste it has or the warmth it gives off, is somehow pleasant. Or also maybe the sensation is unpleasant, like maybe it has a disgusting smell, or maybe it is so cold to the touch that it's freezing. But beauty is not about that. Beauty is not about the sensations I receive. Beauty means that something gives me pleasure by its mere form. So Kant would say that there needs to be a multiplicity of sensations. He would say that one singular sensation cannot be beautiful. So imagine a sound, one and the same sound, just constant, like one musical note being played constantly. Um, there is no particular beauty in that. But now, if you imagine several sounds, and some of them on a higher note, some on a lower note, um, some of them following in quick succession, then a bit of a longer pause. Um, the several sounds ordered into a melody, that could be beautiful. Or likewise, a singular color is not beautiful, Kant would say. Um, Here, our everyday language, once again, is not so clear because we may call a color beautiful, but really Kant would say, no, if you just imagine a singular color, it's not beautiful. If you imagine, for example, a room which is painted, all the walls and the ceiling and the floor completely in one color, it could be pleasant. Like you could say, this one sensation I get is pleasant to my eye. Maybe it's a soft color that I like to look at, or it could be unpleasant. Maybe it's too strong of a color. Maybe it's a stark neon color that somehow hurts my eye. But you cannot really say that as a singular sensation it is beautiful. But now, if you take several colors and you put them in some sort of order, like in a painting or in a sunset, that can be beautiful. Or if you think of a stone, like just a block of stone, that's not especially beautiful. Maybe it can be pleasant as a sensation, like if you touch that stone, maybe because it's not rough but very smooth, you find it pleasant to the touch. But as a stone block, it's not beautiful. But here, imagine that a stonemason comes along and chisels that block into a beautiful statue. So gives a specific form to that block. Now that form you might find beautiful. And here Fichte says, which I think fits quite well, would the stone have become beautiful thereby? The stone forever remains stone and is incapable of such a predicate. But the soul of the artist was beautiful when he conceived his work. And the soul of any sensible contemplator will become beautiful who conceives it after him. The stone, however, forever remains dead, which limits the outer eye during that inner spiritual development. So what Kant is saying is that sensations as such can be pleasant or unpleasant, but they can never be beautiful, and therefore a singular sensation could not be beautiful. You need a multiplicity of sensations, and as soon as you have more than one, as soon as you have two, they need to have some sort of connection. And it is that connection, it is that form that they take, the form in which we view them, which might be beautiful. So it is the harmony of these singular sensations, like the harmony of sounds or the harmony of colors, which we find beautiful. And as I already said, and as I explained further in the lecture on sensuality, there are two forms of viewing to Kant: time and space. And therefore, there are, generally speaking, two forms in which something can appear to us and in which something can be beautiful to us, Kant would say. And the form something can take in space, he calls a shape. And so it says there are things that have a beautiful shape to us. So, like, for example, a beautiful statue or beautiful architecture, beautiful building. And then on the other hand, there's time and the form something can take in the succession of time. In this form, Kant calls not a shape, but a play. What he means is something like rhythm or melody. So the play of sensations, the play of sounds which succeed each other in time. And something can therefore be beautiful to us not through its shape, but through the way it plays. And that is the case with music. And then certainly both can also be combined, Kant would say. So here the example that he gives is dance. In dance, you have a play not of sensations, like you have in music, where you have a play of the sounds, but rather you have a play of shapes, Kant says. So here you have a form of art that sort of combines time and space. You have these bodies in space that take certain shapes that move in certain ways, but these shapes, they are not static like in a statue, but they succeed each other in time. But all art or all beauty, also the beauty in nature, according to Kant, can be reduced to this, to shape and play or a combination of that. So to the form that things take in time and space. I said in the lecture on sensuality that the five senses are not equal to Kant, but rather touch and seeing and hearing, they are more objective according to him. They are senses that actually let us cognize something, while which is also why he calls them senses of instruction, while taste and smell are called by him senses of savoring, and they are more subjective. They are less connected to the faculty of cognition and more to the feeling of pleasure and displeasure. And that is also why here, when it comes to the beautiful, Kant would say that we can only find beauty through the eyes and through the ears. There is no beauty, he says, in smelling or in tasting. That is only connected to sense pleasure, so it can be pleasant or unpleasant, but it cannot be beautiful or ugly. Again, everyday language may call something a beautiful smell, but really it's just a pleasant smell. I'm not quite sure I agree here with Kant completely. I would say, well, when it comes to taste and smell, you also have a multiplicity of sensations, right? Like usually you don't just taste one taste, like just saltiness, but rather in a dish there's different components. There's salt, there's different vegetables, and so on. And therefore, I would say that they take a certain form, the way they are combined. And I would say that they too can be combined in a form that has a certain harmony. So I would say that at least potentially, at least on principle, it should be possible to talk about the beauty of a smell or the beauty of a certain dish. It should be possible to say this cook is an artist and he composed the various sensations, the various singular tastes in a beautiful manner. However, what is true is that smelling and tasting is always also directly connected to the sense pleasure and therefore to pathological interest. And that is why here it is especially hard or even completely impossible to abstract from your pathological interest and to just make a disinterested judgment about a smell or about a taste, to not judge the actual sensations and whether they are pleasant to you, but to judge just the form in which these sensations are combined. While when it comes to hearing or seeing, it is easier to abstract from your interests. So I would say that on principle, I disagree with Kant. It should be possible to say a taste or a smell is beautiful too, or rather a combination of tastes and smells, but that is basically everything we taste or smell. But I think practically Kant is still somewhat right. Usually these judgments, they cannot be pure and pure aesthetical judgments. They will always have judgments about what is pleasant or not mixed in. So what Kant says is that beauty, when we go by relation, means that something is purposive in its mere form, in the way the multiplicity of singular sensations is ordered together in the harmonious way, in the mere form that we view it in time or space. But still, the question remains, what does that actually mean? I mean, Kant is saying the beautiful is purposive without having a purpose. And someone could be discontent with that explanation. Someone could even become suspicious that he's just being distracted with meaningless words here. I mean, all of that sounds nice and so on, but when it comes down to it, it's nonsense, right? How can something be purposive without actually having a purpose? Well, what Kant means by that is that it has no objective purposiveness. Like, it has no purpose for an object. There is no action that we would undertake outside in the world for which the beautiful could serve us. But it has a subjective purposiveness. It is not purposive for an object, it is purposive for us, the subject who views the beautiful thing. And in a way, you could say that of anything which causes pleasure. In 2 lectures ago, in my lecture on pleasure, I said that to Kant, the feeling of pleasure in general comes from us having a feeling of our vitality, of our life energy, so to say, being strengthened. So basically, pleasure is always a feeling of subjective purposiveness, a feeling that this thing which gives me pleasure is purposive for me, for the subject. But when it comes to the sense pleasure, to me taking delight in the pleasant, then I find it, let's say, a meal that tastes good for me, or let's say sex that feels satisfying for me, I find this thing to be subjectively purposive for my body, for my physicality, so to speak. I find my bodily functions improved by it. I find my my physical vitality to be strengthened by it. That is not the case when it comes to the beautiful. Rather here, I find my intellectuality strengthened by it. I find that it is purposive for me as a subject, not insofar as I have a body, but it is purposive for my faculty of cognition. And that is what Kant means when he says that the beautiful is purposive without having a purpose. It has no purpose for an object in the world. It is purposive for me as a subject, for my faculty of cognition. But to understand how that is, you need to understand Kant's theory of cognition. You need to understand his epistemology, because it is very closely connected to that. Which really, if you think about it, should come as no surprise, because I mean, we are always one and the same being, right? Whether I look at something to try and have a cognition of it, to try and understand what it is, or whether I look at something to just judge it aesthetically, to just judge whether it gives me pleasure or not, to just judge its beauty, it is still the same me who is looking at it, and it is still the same view, so to say. It is still the same eye, so to say, with which I'm looking. But this is typical for Kant, and this is very important to me. This is something I want to show with these lectures. Kant is a very systematic and architectonic thinker, and all the various parts of his thinking, they all fit together and depend on each other. They make one whole, and you can't really disagree with just parts of it or agree with just parts of it. You sort of need to either accept the whole or dismiss the whole, because it connects so much. And unfortunately, nowadays, when you look at the academic mainstream and how they deal with Kant, it often happens in a very superficial manner. You have many professors who nowadays will dismiss Kant's epistemology and will claim, oh, we know better now, we moved beyond Kant. But at the same time, his theory of beauty is still somewhat popular. I would assume because they think it's harmless, because they think nothing really follows from it, so you might as well accept it. While when it comes to his epistemology and his moral theory, they sense that if they accepted it, they would have to deeply change as people and to aufklären themselves, which they don't want. But my point is that this is inconsistent. You cannot accept Kant's theory of beauty without first accepting his epistemology, because it is completely based on that. And for that reason, what I'm going to explain now will probably be hard to understand if you don't understand Kant's epistemology. I already explained this in previous lectures, so my advice is, if something I'm going to say now is unclear to you, or is difficult to understand, you should go back to those earlier lectures, because I think if you have listened to all of those and understood those, then what I'm going to say now should be quite clear, actually. When it comes to experience, there are three faculties of ours taking part in that process of experience. Two belong to sensuality, that is sense itself, and the power of imagination, and I talked about both of them in my lecture on sensuality. And then there's the intellect, which I also talked about in the lecture on what is the intellect. And the sense just gives us sensations, colors, smells, tastes, sounds, and this doesn't matter here. Because as I already said, sensations, they can be pleasant or unpleasant, but they as such cannot be beautiful. So that leaves us with the power of imagination and with the intellect, which are, as Kant likes to put it, like two old friends who don't really get along, but also cannot leave each other alone. And what they do in experience is, the power of imagination, or more specifically the productive power of imagination, not the reproductive power of imagination, which we may need for remembering and stuff, but the productive power of imagination apprehends the sensations. I talked about that in its own lecture. I made a lecture on the apprehension, it basically means sensations as such don't make perception yet. If we only had sensations, we would have a chaos of tastes and smells and colors, but they would not form a coherent image. It is the power of imagination which apprehends these sensations. That means it takes them up, it takes them into itself, into the power of imagination, and then forms an image out of them, gives them, so to say, a form that they have in time and space, and that is then a perception. And well, the intellect, as the faculty of rules or of concepts, the intellect provides the concept by which we understand this perception, by which we understand what that image is of. So I have the image of an animal in front of me, and now I have various concepts of dog and cat and bird and fish, and now I can understand this is a dog and not a cat, for example. So this is very briefly the various parts of this process of experience. Again, you can go back to the respective lectures if you want to get deeper into that. And now what Kant says about beauty is that the beautiful puts these two faculties of cognition, the power of imagination and the intellect, into a free and harmonious play with each other. And that is exactly why it gives us pleasure. That is exactly why we feel our vitality, again, our intellectuality in this case, our faculties of cognition, to be strengthened by it. Because the beautiful is purposive not for any action happening outside in the world, but it is purposive for our faculties of cognition because of the harmonious play it brings them into, so to say. So really what we like about it is that it is sort of cognizable even without us cognizing and understanding anything about it. So I don't need to understand what the beautiful is, but it has a form that would make it easy to understand it. So it is really this form which we enjoy. If you think about it, something that is pure chaos, like a garbage can spilled over on the streets, or generally if you see a big pile of garbage, of waste, like things that don't fit together and they are just thrown over one another, there's no order in it, you don't find it beautiful because it's just pure chaos, and you can't easily cognize it. Your power of imagination has a hard time apprehending all of it because there's such a multiplicity of sensations, so many things, so many parts, and they don't fit neatly together. They can't be turned into one image that we can easily apprehend and overlook, so to say. And also the intellect, as the faculty of rules, can't really give a rule for this. Like, there is no rule here for this pile of garbage. It was not ordered in a sensible manner. Things were just thrown on this pile without thinking. But on the other hand, when we find something beautiful, Kant says what we find beautiful is what has a certain order, a certain proportion, a certain rhythm, a certain harmony, symmetry, but also not too stark contrast. So there is no gap, no breach. Those are things we find beautiful. Like, think of a face. If it's too disproportionate, like one eye is way bigger than the other one, and the eyebrows are too thick, and the nose is too crooked, we don't find it beautiful. But if it's a well proportionate, somewhat symmetrical face, then it's more beautiful, because it sort of lends itself to our faculties of cognition. They can sort of take it up easily. So if I wanted to cognize, to understand it, I easily could. And that is why I feel strengthened by it, why I feel a certain pleasure in it. What happens here, Kant would say, is that the power of imagination, it plays with the beautiful. So we sort of, with the productive power of imagination, produce the beautiful image and keep producing it in our minds. So if you hear a beautiful melody, you sort of compose it on in your mind. Or if you see beautiful engravings, beautiful intricate lines, you sort of continue them in your mind. Your power of imagination plays with them. But if it was only that, then there would be excess of imagination. There would be wild fantasy. So what also happens is that the intellect, as the faculty of rules, comes into this, and it sort of restricts the power of imagination in its play. It restricts it to staying within the bounds of regularity, of what fits with rules in general, with lawfulness in general. And this continuous play of the two faculties of cognition, of the power of imagination producing sort of the beautiful thing. And I would say, so Kant doesn't say it in these words, but I would say that means the beautiful turns us into an artist. I will talk about what Kant says about art and about genius in future lectures soon. But I would say that in a way, when you see something beautiful, whether in nature or a beautiful work of art, you yourself, to a degree, become an artist. You don't just take that picture in passively and then put it somewhere and you are done with it. You would maybe do that in cognition, in experience, when you just want to understand what something is. But here you play with it, and that means you sort of continue it. You sort of continue the melody or the picture. You sort of, at least in your mind, at least unconsciously, do art yourself, produce the beautiful yourself. But at the same time, once again, so there is no excess of fantasy. The intellect sort of restricts this play, and in their interplay, in this harmony between the power of imagination and the intellect, there comes this pleasure that we call beauty. And now in the process of making experience, there is one more factor. There is the power of judgment. And the power of judgment is sort of the bridge between the intellect and sensuality. So the power of imagination and the image it gives us, the perception it gives us. And the power of judgment, again, I made its own lecture about the power of judgment, and there I talked about it more extensively. The power of judgment can be the determining or the reflecting power of judgment. And when it comes to making experience, then it's usually the determining power of judgment, which takes the concepts of the intellect and applies them to that sensual image that the power of imagination provides. So again, I see an animal in front of me, and now I have these various concepts in my intellect, like dog or cat or bird or whatever, and the determining power of judgment decides that this concept of dog fits best for this image. This is what I'm seeing as a dog and not a cat. Well, here in this case, it is not so when it comes to beauty, it is not the determining power of judgment which is at play, but rather it is the reflecting power of judgment. The reflecting power of judgment is not applying rules and determining things according to rules which the intellect already has, but rather it is reflecting about something, so about a central image, and it is trying to find a rule for something for which we don't have a rule yet. And as I said in the lecture on the power of judgment, this reflecting power of judgment can be either teleological, which doesn't matter for us at this point, or it can be the aesthetical reflecting power of judgment, so the one that is just contemplating. I mean, that is what aesthesis means in Greek. It's basically viewing, contemplation. And this aesthetical power of judgment, this is the taste for Kant, as I already said in the lecture on taste. So what we are doing is we are given an image in the power of imagination, a central image, like we are seeing a flower or a sunset or whatever. And our reflecting power of judgment reflects the form that this image has in time or space, and it compares this form with the general laws of the intellect. The intellect, as the faculty of rules, in this case doesn't give a specific rule, a specific concept. I don't say this flower that I see is a rose or it's a tulip or whatever. I mean, I could, but then that would be a cognition, right? That would not have to do with how beautiful the flower is, but with understanding what it is. So here, my power of judgment is not seeking a specific rule. It just compares the form of this flower with the laws of the intellect, of the faculty of rules in general. And it finds, so to say, this flower ruleful. So it finds that the flower is formed in a way that would make it easy to apply a rule to it. That would make it easy to understand, to cognize this flower, even though I'm not doing that here when I'm just judging about its beauty. And that is exactly why I take pleasure in it. This is, so what the power of judgment is doing here, this is very much connected to the schematism, which is sort of the last piece of the puzzle of Kant's epistemology. And again, I already made a lecture on the schematism. And there I said that since sensuality and the central image that the power of imagination gives us, that we are viewing, and on the other hand, intellectuality and the concept, the general rule that the intellect gives, since they are different as oil and water, completely disconnected, there needs to be a third, a middle thing to connect them. And when it comes to experience, that is the schema. I said there that the determining power of judgment needs the schema to apply the intellect's rules, the concepts, to sensuality, to determine sensuality according to those rules. So, for example, you have the pure intellectual concept of causality, one of the 12 categories of our thinking. But causality as such, just as a concept, only means that if A is posited, then necessarily B is also the case. Simply by virtue of A being the case, B is the case. But you don't really know what that is supposed to mean, or how you know that causality is in place in the world, unless you understand this concept, this pure intellectual concept, through its schema. That is, unless you apply it to time. Because now you can say, well, causality is when A happens first and then B always by necessity succeeds A in time. That is how you know that A is the cause of B. If that was not the case, without time, without this necessary succession in time, we could not tell if causality is in place. Well, here when it comes to beauty, sort of the opposite is happening. What Kant is saying is that the power of judgment, the reflecting power of judgment, is schematizing freely here. Because in experience, you have a concrete, a specific concept of the intellect, like the concept of causality, or the concept of substance, or the concept of unity. And in order for the determining power of judgment to be able to apply this concept to sensuality, it is sort of filled with sensuality, but just with the general form of sensuality. Not with a specific sensual image, with specific sensations of red or sweet or warm or whatever, but rather the specific concept of causality, of substance, and so on, is just filled with the general form of sensuality that is with time. Here, when it comes to the beautiful, the opposite is happening in a way. You have a specific sensual image, like you are seeing this flower or this sunset or this bird or whatever, and the reflecting power of judgment sort of combines in its free schematizing that image not with a specific concept of the intellect. So it doesn't say this flower is a rose, or this bird song that I enjoy is the song of a nightingale, or whatever. I don't need to know that to enjoy the beauty of it. But rather, the specific sensual image by the reflecting power of judgment is brought together just with the form of the intellect. Not with a specific concept, but with the form of, let's say, conceptuality, or with the form of regularity in general. And since I find a certain regularity in this sensual image, since I find that it has a way, it has a form that would allow me to easily bring it under a rule, to easily apply concepts to it, even though I am not applying concepts to it if I'm just judging its beauty. That is what I enjoy about it. That is what gives me pleasure. In that way, there's an analogy or relation between the beautiful and the true to Kant, which is not to say that beauty and truth are the same thing. Because a representation that we have, as such, as a representation, is not necessarily connected to anything. It can be, let's say you have a nightmare, then this is both untrue, like it's not a real experience, it's just a nightmare, and it is not beautiful. It is horrible in some way. But a representation can, of course, be related to something. And when it comes to truth, Kant's definition, he didn't come up with that. It was already the accepted definition amongst logicians in the 18th century. And I talked about this in previous lectures. Kant's definition of truth is that truth is a representation matching its object. So if I have a representation, an image in my head of white mice, but the object is not there, there actually aren't any white mice outside of my head, then I'm hallucinating and going crazy. But if I am seeing white mice and there actually are white mice, then that is true. Then I have a true representation. So truth again means that a representation matches or is congruent with its object. Well, beauty, on the other hand, to Kant would mean that a representation matches or is congruent with its subject, with the one representing it. So if I have the representation of a beautiful flower, it may be true or untrue. So there may be an actual object, an actual flower, or I may just hallucinate it. But that doesn't matter when it comes to its beauty. What matters is that it is in accordance not just maybe with an object outside of this representation, but rather this representation is in accordance with me, with myself, with my own faculty of cognition, with my intellect and my power of imagination. And that is exactly why I enjoy this representation. You could say that when it comes to cognition, we take our representations and we compare them with the object, and we try to find out if they fit the object, if what I think, what I imagine of the object actually fits the actual object out there in the world. Well, when it comes to beauty, you could say that it is the other way around. You take the object, but only the form of the object, not the content, not the sensations it gives you, just its mere form, and you compare the form of the object with your faculty of cognition, and we are asking if it fits with that. So basically, what Kant is saying and what Kant means when he says that the beautiful is purposive without having a purpose is that it is as if the beautiful thing was made for me, as if it was made just by me. When I look at something beautiful or listen to something beautiful or whatever, and I judge that it is beautiful, what I basically say by calling it beautiful is, if I, with my intellect, had produced something to fit my intellect with its general regularity, so if I had set out to produce something which could easily be taken up by my intellect without, so to say, giving it a hard time, then I would have created this very thing. Then I could not have given it a better form than this beautiful thing I'm seeing here. So in a way, when we find something beautiful, it is as if another intellect had created it, and our intellect, since it is also intellect, would recognize that other intellect in it, would sort of recognize itself. It recognizes the regularity, which is the mark of intellectuality. So in a way, it is as if in a beautiful object, I'm seeing the mark, the signature of its creator, of the artist. And you could maybe say that when it comes to art, that actually is the case. Because to Kant, there are two kinds of beauty, the beauty of art and the beauty of nature. art is done by a being like me, which has intellect. And it is this mark of the intellect which gives the artwork its beautiful form. Like you can put a monkey in front of a piano and let it randomly hit on the keys of the piano, but that will probably not sound beautiful. But if someone with intellect plays the piano and through that intellect of his gives the specific sounds a certain melody, a certain rhythm, a certain harmony, then that can sound beautiful. Or likewise, you can just splash paint on a canvas. That will probably not look beautiful. But again, if an artist with intellect, who probably thinks about what he's doing, if he uses this paint to paint in certain forms with a certain regularity, that can turn into a beautiful picture. Or likewise, if you just took random words, like just let a word generator randomly mix words and produce complete nonsense, there's nothing beautiful about that. But when you have a poet put those words into a certain order, give them a certain harmony, make them rhyme maybe, it can produce a beautiful poem. So in a way, in the artwork, you recognize the handwriting, so to say, the signature of the artist. You recognize that this is not random, because randomness is sort of the opposite of beauty. Chaos is the opposite of beauty. What we find beautiful is the sort of regularity, the harmony in it. And of course, when it comes to the beautiful in nature, there is no artist here. At least we don't know of an artist. Kant says, sure, could be that God designed the beautiful flower or whatever to be so beautiful, but we don't know that. But this is not what Kant means to say. He's not trying to say that there is an artist behind this. But even as someone believing in evolution, or even as a complete atheist, you have to admit that beautiful things in nature, like the feathers of a beautiful bird, like a beautiful butterfly, beautiful flowers, coral reefs, they look as if an artist, as if a creator had shaped them. And again, when we call them beautiful, we are sort of saying, I could not have done it better. If I had asked to design nature, so as to make it, so to say, cognizable for our faculty of cognition, I could not have done a better job. This was shaped perfectly, even if it actually wasn't shaped by anyone on purpose that way. So, again, when nature is random, when we clearly see that there mustn't be a creator behind it, it could just be coincidence. Like if you just have a wasteland, if you just have an empty desert, so it's very easy to see how just the mechanical laws of nature could have created this by coincidence. This landscape is not very beautiful. But something so intricate, so harmoniously shaped, like a rose, something that looks as if an artist had created it, that is exactly what we find beautiful. Our intellect enjoys sort of recognizing itself, enjoys recognizing intellectuality or regularity, and it enjoys if something sort of presents itself to it, to the intellect, so that it can be taken up easily by the intellect. And maybe now you can better understand Kant's stance when it comes to the various possible explanations of the beautiful. I already talked about this 2 lectures ago in the lecture on pleasure. There I said that when it comes to explaining beauty, there have traditionally been two positions, empiricism and rationalism. And the empiricists would say that the beautiful just appeals to our senses. So basically, they would reduce the beautiful to that which is just pleasant and not see a difference between the beautiful and the pleasant. And that is something Kant disagrees with. So, in that sense, I already said he's a rationalist, because aesthetical rationalism claims that no, the beautiful doesn't simply appeal to our senses, but there's thinking involved in finding things beautiful, which is also why animals can take pleasure in something that is pleasant to them, but they don't know this pleasure that is beauty. In that sense, Kant is indeed a rationalist. And all rationalists will basically say in one way or another that beauty has to do with purposiveness and with us, through our thinking, recognizing the purposiveness of the beautiful object. But now here comes the difference between the dogmatic, objective rationalists, like Baumgarten, the successor of Wolff on the professorship in Halle, or the subjective critical rationalism of Kant. Because the question is, okay, the beautiful things, they are purposive. So they have a shape or a play. So in general, they have a form which somehow we enjoy. Well, how come? Why do they have this form? Here Kant says there are two possible positions you can take. You can be a realist of purposiveness or an idealist of purposiveness. And of course, as always, Kant is an idealist. What that is specifically, I talked about that in my lecture on transcendental idealism, which I recommend because that is Kant's general theory that runs as a red thread through all parts of his philosophy, be it his epistemology, his theory of beauty, and so on. So you really need to understand that to understand Kant. Well, the realist of purposiveness says that there really is a purpose. The beautiful things, they have been made with a purpose by the artist, or when it comes to nature, maybe by God. So they really, hence realism, they really have this purposive form. And that would basically mean that beauty is something objective. It is in the sense that it actually is in the object. In the sense that the object is beautiful without us recognizing it. And if we humans vanish, the objects would still be beautiful. And we would just be the ones to recognize and to state that the objects are beautiful. Just like when an object has other attributes, when an object is red or salty or whatever, we are just the ones to recognize and state that it has these properties. So really, we would be passive, we would be victims when it comes to beauty. We would be forced to call this or that beautiful because it is. And therefore, the judgment on beauty would not be a free judgment. Kant, however, is saying that it is a free judgment. He is an idealist of purposiveness. That means he says that the purposiveness of the beautiful objects is ideal. It is in our thinking and to our thinking. So in that sense, beauty is subjective. That doesn't mean, as it's usually understood in everyday language that it is just a private judgment, so everyone can judge different things to be beautiful. As I already said in the lecture on taste, the judgment is subjective, but still universal, because all subjects, all human beings are similar in their basic makeup, in the way they cognize things. But still, the judgment on beauty is subjective. So if we didn't exist to find things beautiful, then they would not be beautiful. They don't have their purposiveness in themselves as an objective attribute, but rather it just so happens when we view them and when we judge them that we find that their form fits with our faculties of cognition. This is also important because that also means that you can't use this as a proof of God. So if you are tempted to say, well, nature is so purposive, look at how beautiful these things in nature are, this flower, for example, this cannot be a random coincidence, someone must have designed it, there must be a God behind it. This argument for God Kant calls the physico-theological argument, and it's one of the arguments he refutes. I will talk more about that argument and how he refutes it when I get to his philosophy of religion, but that is important to him. If you were a realist of purposiveness, then maybe you could think that the physico-theological argument is a good argument. But Kant is an idealist of purposiveness. He's not saying there is a divine artist who made nature in this way. He's just saying nature appears to us as if designed by an artist with an intellect. And that is, when it appears to us as such, that is when we find it beautiful. But that does not allow us to say that it really is purposive. And therefore it also doesn't allow us to say there really is such an artist. Kant says at one point, if the realism of purposiveness was right, as dogmatic rationalists claim, then that would mean that nature, by being beautiful, bestows a grace upon us. It made itself, it shaped itself, or maybe God shaped nature with the explicit purpose of being beautiful to us. But since this is not the case, since Kant's critical rationalism favors the idealism of purposiveness, Kant says it's not that nature bestows a grace upon us by deciding to be beautiful, but rather we take in the nature that we see, that we experience with grace by deciding to find it beautiful. It is us who bestow beauty upon nature and who thereby take a liking to nature, who grace nature by finding it beautiful. Now, to prevent misunderstandings, I want to emphasize once more that what Kant says is that there must be a play between our faculties of cognition, between the power of imagination and the intellect. So it is not enough to find something beautiful that it sort of lends itself to being cognized. It's not enough that it has a certain regularity in its form and therefore, so to say, doesn't give us a hard time. Because if that were the case, then a straight line or a perfect circle would be the most beautiful things ever. But clearly they are not. Like, they are also not ugly because they are not distorted and disproportionate. But they are certainly not beautiful. And that is because taking them in, understanding them, is sort of too easy. We cannot play with them. I take one glance at a circle and I know exactly what it is. It is a circle. Kant says the beautiful must have a certain regularity, symmetry, harmony, order, but it must not be too orderly. For example, imagine a face that was created by AI by comparing 1,000 different human faces and sort of creating a standard face. These faces, they may not be ugly, but they are never especially beautiful because they lack character. There's nothing significant about them. And Kant would say, for a face to be truly beautiful, sure, it should have some symmetry. It should not be too disproportionate, but there must be something breaking that symmetry. Maybe a beauty mark on the cheek, or maybe slightly more prominent eyebrows, or a slightly longer nose. There must be something that allows us to play with it. That, as I already said, allows us to, in our minds, become artists ourselves. That allows our productive power of imagination to not just take in that image, but actually do something with that image. For the same reason, Kant would say that the English gardens, so the English gardens that are sort of more imitating of nature and of a real landscape, why they are more beautiful than these too orderly Baroque gardens. For something to be beautiful, it must not be completely chaotic and disharmonious. It must sort of lend itself to us to be easily taken up, easily apprehended, but still it must allow us to play with it. That is also why beauty is not something that you just glance at and then go on, right? For cognition, that is often enough. Like, I can take one glance out of my window and that's enough to see there's a house, or there's a tree, there's a car. I know at first glance that this thing is a tree and not an airplane. But it is not enough for me to just glance at something beautiful. Like the sunset, I'm not content to glance out of my window once and see, beautiful sunset, and then go on. But rather, when I see a beautiful sunset or a beautiful meadow of flowers, I want to look at it for longer. I want to deal with it for a time. Because, again, I want to sort of play with it in my mind. I think by play, Kant has found a wonderful word to describe what happens in beauty. Finding something beautiful is not something static. Your faculty of cognition is not static, and you are not immediately done with the beautiful, but rather it is something dynamic. There really is an interplay between that image and between our intellect with its regularity, and we keep playing with it. That is why the beautiful keeps giving us pleasure, why we can even come back to the same beautiful, let's say, garden or painting or whatever, and find new pleasure in it. We are not just done with it because we can continuously keep playing with it, so to say. And if you understood this, that the beautiful is the purposive without purpose, that which is purposive not for an object, but for us, for our faculty of cognition, then it should now also be easier to understand how it can bring pleasure to us without being of interest to us. And this is also important to answer certain counter arguments to Kant's theory of the beautiful. And maybe some of you who listen to that also have had such counter arguments or such reservations in their head. Because sometimes I've heard people say that something which doesn't interest us cannot bring us pleasure. And even within philosophy, not just by complete lay people, but even within philosophy, you find this criticism. Like, for example, Nietzsche heavily criticizes Kant's theory of the beautiful because he says we are never completely disinterested in life. Because we are living beings, we have an interest in ourselves. And Nietzsche says, even if we were completely disinterested while contemplating something, then it would not be beautiful to us, but just endlessly boring. But I think that this disagreement with Kant is only caused by a misunderstanding of what Kant means. It is caused by the way in which Kant uses the word interest. Because, once again, to Kant, interest means specifically interest in the reality of an object. Now, Nietzsche would say that we have an interest in ourselves. And that is why we enjoy beauty. Because the beautiful sort of strengthens us. It makes us feel more alive to view something beautiful. In the language of Nietzsche's philosophy, it strengthens our will to power. But the thing is, I think Nietzsche is disagreeing with Kant here only in words, only in the letter, but not in the spirit. Because, yes, Kant would say the same thing. And if you want to use the word interest for that, sure, you could say we have an interest in ourselves. And in that sense, if you go back to my lecture on pleasure and displeasure, Kant would say that all pleasure is caused because we feel strengthened. We feel more alive in a way. So you could say that, yes, all pleasure is caused by an interest we have in ourselves and in our own lives. It is just that Kant happens to not call this interest. When he talks of interest, he always means wanting a certain object to be real in a certain way. He is not talking about us caring about ourselves and about how we feel. And you could disagree with the way Kant uses his words. You could say maybe that's a bad way to use the word interest and he should have used it in another way. But that doesn't change his theory of beauty as such. You could debate what the best words are to describe something while still agreeing on that something. And I think Kant and Nietzsche are in deeper agreement than Nietzsche realized. Because, yes, Kant too says the beautiful is that which in a way makes us feel more alive. But Kant would ask, more alive in what sense? And that more specific question is one that Nietzsche, who is a less systematic thinker, didn't really ask. Well, what Kant says is that the beautiful, unlike the pleasant, unlike food or sex or whatever, doesn't make us feel more alive in a physical sense. It doesn't make our body feel more alive, but rather it makes us feel more alive not as animals, but as intellectual beings. It makes our intellect, so to say, or our faculty of cognition feel more alive. By the disharmony and chaos of the ugly, our faculty of cognition would feel sort of blocked. The ugly gives it a hard time, and therefore it gives us displeasure. But that which is beautiful, that we enjoy because it makes our faculty of cognition feel more alive, so to say. And that is exactly why only beings such as we are can appreciate beauty. As I already said in the lecture on pleasure, animals only know sense pleasure, And a pure intellectual being like God could know this intellectual pleasure of approving of the good, but they both don't know beauty, because beauty uh, is only for beings which are sensual. I mean, it is only sensuality which can be beautiful. Kant stresses this. It is nonsense, he would say, to speak of beautiful thoughts. Thoughts can be correct or good, but they cannot be beautiful in the actual sense. Beautiful is something which I view in time and space, something I hear or something I see. So beauty is for sensual beings, but for beings who don't just have sensations, but who sort of order and apprehend and systematize and bring under rules their sensations. And such beings then take pleasure in viewing something which lends itself to these activities, which has a certain, let's say, orderability and cognizability and regulatability, if you want to express it in that way. And that is why we enjoy looking at the beautiful. And that enjoyment, of course, cannot be disinterested if by interest you mean something you care about, because sure, then disinterested enjoyment is nonsense. I mean, having pleasure of any sort means wanting to have that pleasure, enjoying that pleasure. Again, I talked about that in my lecture on what is pleasure to Kant. He says pleasure is a representation which causes us to want to keep or repeat that representation. So in that sense, you could say there's an interest here. But we are disinterested in the object. We don't want anything from the beautiful object. Like, we don't want to eat it or to keep it or whatever. All we care about here is the representation itself, is that which we are viewing. But with that, I'm done with the third moment of the beautiful. So, according to quantity, as I addressed in the last lecture, the judgment of beauty is universal. And as explained now in this lecture, according to quality, it is disinterested. And according to relation, it is about something which is purposive, merely in its form and not for any objective cause, but just for me as a subject, for my faculty of cognition. But I don't want to close this also already long lecture without having talked about the fourth and last moment of the judgment of the beautiful, and that is the modality of that judgment. And here, if you look at the table of judgments or the table of categories, or if you go back to my 2 lectures I gave on these topics, when it comes to modality, Kant says judgments are either problematic, assertive, or apodictic. Or if you go with the categories, you have possibility, existence, and necessity. And well, Kant says when it comes to the modality of pleasure, then you could say that any representation brings pleasure possibly. So it is possible that a representation brings pleasure, but of course it doesn't have to be the case. There are representations that don't bring pleasure. Like if I think that 3 plus 4 is 7, I don't derive any particular pleasure from that sort. Well, the sense pleasure, Kant would say, is a representation in which the pleasure actually exists. So if something, for example, tastes good for me, then there is reality of that pleasure. Well, the beautiful then is a pleasure which is not just possible or just existing, but which is necessary, Kant says. That is what beauty is. It is a necessary pleasure. This, if you have followed these lectures so far, this should come as no surprise at all, because I have already established that to Kant, the judgment about something being beautiful is a synthetic judgment a priori. And in my lecture on what is science to Kant, where I talked about the difference between a priori and a posteriori, I said that all judgments a priori have these two attributes. They are universal. Only judgments a priori can have universality. Judgments from experience can have generality, but not universality. I cannot say this is true without exception from experience. I can only say, well, so far I have not found an exception. It requires a judgment from reason to say something is true universally. And the other attribute of all judgments a priori is that they are necessary. Only through experience can I find something to be the case which also could not be the case. That's exactly why I need experience to confirm that it is the case instead of not being the case. But reason cannot tell me ever that something just so happens to be the case. Reason always tells me that something must be the case. Like reason tells me that 3 plus 4 must be 7. It's not possible that it could be any other number. So if the judgment on beauty is a judgment we do a priori, then of course we judge that the beautiful must be beautiful with necessity. This is of course not an absolute necessity. If that were the case, then we would all agree on what is and what isn't beautiful, and there would be no disagreement. It is a conditioned necessity, Kant says. It depends on us really making a disinterested judgment. As I already explained, most people, even when they think they judge just the beauty of something, actually mix in their interests, and of course our interests are different. Everyone has their own interests, and so therefore we can have disagreements. But if we judged completely non-partially, if we judged only based on being human beings, then it would be necessary to find this beautiful and to not find this beautiful. Because as human beings as such, again, as a homo noumenon, as humanity, as the human in itself, we are of course all the same. And we are made up in the same way. We all have the same basic structure, so to say, of our faculty of cognition. That is, we all have a power of judgment. And as I explained in this lecture, as I explained in the lecture on the power of judgment, this power of judgment can either be the determining power of judgment, and in that case, it takes the concept that the intellect has and determines the central image that we view through the power of imagination, determines them according to those concepts. It says, this thing that I'm seeing here is a dog, and this thing I'm seeing here is a pigeon, and so on. But it can also be the reflecting power of judgment, which doesn't apply rules that the intellect already has, but which seeks rules. And if this reflecting power of judgment is not teleological, but if it works as the aesthetical power of judgment, that is the taste, and or it can be the taste. And here the power of judgment does not subsume, as the determining power of judgment does, a specific viewing under a specific concept of the intellect, but rather it subsumes the faculty of viewing in its freedom under the faculty of the intellect with its regularity. And when it can do so, it judges something to be beautiful. And here, this is exactly why Kant says that the power of judgment is constitutive for the feeling of pleasure and displeasure. Here's a good point to get a bit more systematic and to remind you, so to say, where we are in Kant's whole philosophy. Kant says that there are three thinking faculties: the intellect, the power of judgment, and reason. And I explained all of those and what they do in previous lectures. And basically, what he does in his three critiques is he examines these three faculties, what they do, what they can do, what their limits are. And he basically asks, are they regulative or constitutive? Regulative would mean they are not, so to say, independent, and they are not creating something, so to say, but rather they just work with what they are given and they just regulate it. While constitutive would mean that they actually constitute something. They are the basis, the fundament of something, which without them would not just be irregular, but would not exist at all without them. Where they are regulative, they are heautonomous, so being under laws which come from elsewhere, which they haven't given, while if they are constitutive, they have autonomy, which translated from Greek means giving your own laws, giving laws yourself. And well, what Kant also says is that the human mind has three parts: the faculty of cognition, the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, and the desiring faculty. And what he finds in his critiques is that our three thinking faculties each are constitutive for one of these three faculties of our mind. So the critique of pure reason shows, and I've talked about that in several previous lectures, it shows that when it comes to cognition, the power of judgment and reason are just regulative. So the power of judgment here works mainly as the determining power of judgment. That means it doesn't create its own laws. It just is given concepts and principles by the intellect and by reason, and it just applies them. And reason too, when it comes to cognition, is just regulative. That is sort of the whole point of the critique of pure reason, to show and to prove that. And again, I made a lecture about that, about the regulative function of reason. Reason cannot constitute a new area of cognition. That is what Kant shows. We cannot use reason to transcend experience and to find new cognitions in the supersensual, about God, about immortality of the soul, but rather reason with its principles only regulates our cognition here in this sensual world. It regulates how we seek cognition, how we seek experience. For example, it makes us seek unity in all our experience. It makes us try to not come up with new explanations and new laws all the time, but rather it makes us try and reduce our explanations and laws for nature onto ever fewer ones. But the critique of pure reason has shown that the intellect is also regulative, sure. With its empirical concepts, it just regulates our experience. Like, it lets us understand that that which we are seeing is a dog or a tree or a bird or whatever. But the critique of pure reason has also shown that intellect is constitutive for experience, with its pure intellectual concepts, with its notions, mainly with its 12 categories. Those are concepts that not only are not taken from experience, but rather they are needed in order to even make experience. They are conditions of the possibility of experience. If I didn't have these categories, such as causality or substance or community, I could not experience anything. And that is exactly why they are constitutive for experience. And that is why, in a sense, the intellect is autonomous. It doesn't just work with laws that it is given, but it gives, as Kant says, laws to nature. It makes not a specific laws of nature, of course, that we can only find empirically in natural science, but the general laws of nature, that all substances must remain. They can only change their state, but as substances they must remain. Or that there must be causality. Whenever something happens, it must happen because of a cause that caused it. These are laws that we don't find in nature and just understand through the intellect. That would be heteronomy. But rather, the intellect has autonomy here. It gives those laws to nature, and without them, there would be no nature, no experience for us. That is the result of the critique of pure reason. And the critique of practical reason shows, and I will talk about that when I get to Kant's moral philosophy, that reason, which when it comes to cognition is only regulative, that reason is constitutive when it comes to action. Because reason gives us laws according to which we should act. It is constitutive for our freedom. It is indeed what makes us free. Without reason, we would be like animals, ruled by our instincts and desires, but not free. But reason here has autonomy in that it gives a law, that is the moral law. Again, I will address that in future lectures. Well, here, in the critique of the power of judgment, which is sort of the bridge between the other two, Kant shows that the power of judgment, which when it comes to nature and when it comes to freedom and morality, is just regulative, is just applying the concepts and the laws of the intellect and of reason, that here, when it comes to the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, the power of judgment is constitutive. It sort of creates its own sort of pleasure, the pleasure in the beautiful, which without it would not exist. Just like without the intellect, there would be no nature for us, or without reason, there would be no freedom for us. So there is a difference. Kant says, while the intellect and reason have autonomy, it would be more correct to say that the power of judgment doesn't have just autonomy, it has heautonomy. To understand what that means, you need to understand Greek. Kant isn't nice enough to explain it to us, but basically you could say just autonomy means that you yourself, if you have autonomy, give a law. But the word leaves open to whom you give that law. Do you give it to yourself or to someone else? So again, look at the intellect. The intellect is autonomous, meaning it gives laws, but these laws are not just for the intellect itself, they are for something else, for nature. The intellect gives laws to nature. Heautonomy, if autonomy is translated as self-law giving, then you could translate this word as maybe self-law giving or self-yourself law giving. So what it means is that you give laws, they are not given to you from someone else, but you actively give them yourself. But you also give them not to something else, but to yourself. You give to yourself yourself a law. And that is what the power of judgment does, according to Kant. It sort of gives itself a law. It decides that this thing here in its purposive form is beautiful. That is not objective. It doesn't give objective laws to nature or objective laws to action, to freedom, to morality. It is subjective. It is really just for us. For us, this thing is beautiful. It's not objectively beautiful and independently of us, but for us, it is beautiful because we sort of make it beautiful for us. We judge it to be beautiful, and thereby it is beautiful. And Kant says, in order for this to be possible, to make the judgment that something will cause universal pleasure with necessity, in order for that to be possible, you need to posit a common sense. Now, by common sense, Kant doesn't mean what you usually mean by the word common sense. The word Kant uses is Gemeinsinn, and I'm just translating Gemeinsinn literally, and literally in English it means common sense. But what English speakers mean when saying common sense usually is actually not common sense. It is more like common intellect, right? You don't mean that you sense the same thing. You mean by common sense that you think the same thing. You mean that every common person who's not a complete idiot should be smart enough to be thinking this. In fact, that which in English is usually called the common sense, in German is called gesunder Menschenverstand. So healthy human intellect. And I think that's a better way to call it. So I just want to stress it, that by common sense, I don't mean common sense. No, what Kant means with this is that really we must have in common sort of the same sense. This is a condition of the possibility of us being able to communicate our cognitions with each other. And I mean, clearly we are able to do this, right? If I understand something, if I find a certain truth, like the solution to a mathematical equation, or I find a new animal species, or I find how exactly this animal species lives, what its habits are, and so on. Doesn't matter. If I have any sort of knowledge, then I should be able to communicate that knowledge to other human beings somehow. But this is such a regular, such a daily thing. I mean, we constantly communicate knowledge to each other. I am currently communicating knowledge to you, and I'm communicating knowledge to you, which before Kant has communicated to me. This is such a common everyday occurrence that we don't think much about it and we don't question it much. But to Kant, it is really important. It is, in fact, to him an important subjective and psychological criterion of truth. So I will get into that more when I talk about Kant's concept of Aufklärung. But basically it says that thinking for yourself, thinking independently is all fine and good. But how do you know that you thought something correct and true instead of thinking up complete nonsense? The only way you can know is through pluralism, through communicating your thoughts, your insights to others, and seeing if they still make sense to others. Like, if I draw a conclusion with my reason that seems right to me, but I find that everyone else thinks it's absurd and it's nonsense, then I should question it. Or if I see something which everyone else cannot see, then maybe I'm hallucinating. In fact, that is one reason Kant criticizes what he calls Schwärmerei in German, so enthusiasm. You could also say mysticism, because the mystics, they have their visions God, of unity with God or whatever, of unity with the whole world, and they cannot communicate these visions properly. No one else has had these visions after all. And the mystics say as much. If you read works by great mystics, they will stress that really what they are describing is more like an allegory or metaphor. There is really no way to properly communicate and make you understand what they saw when they had the mystical union with God or whatever. And Kant would reply to that, well, if that is the case, then how do you know that you really had a mystical union with God and not just a hallucination or some weird fantasy or whatever? So to him, it is really important that we can communicate our insights. Again, it's a subjective psychological criterion for truth. But now the question is, how is that even possible? It happens daily, so we usually don't question it. But how is it possible that something I understand, you can understand too, and I can try to make you understand? I can communicate it to you. Well, Kant says it is only possible if we posit a common sense that all human beings share. Because in order for us to have a cognition, our various faculties of cognition, our intellect, our sensuality, they must fit together. They must be in the right proportion, right? So I can have a concept of something. I can have a concept, for example, of dogs and know exactly what a dog is. But if I see a dog from very far away, so far it's just a small dot, I really cannot apply my concept properly. I cannot know, is this a dog or is it a cat maybe? I need to be closer to properly see the dog. So my various faculties of cognition need to be in the right proportion. And when they are, it sort of clicks, right? So when you see a dog and you know what a dog is, it just fits together and you know this is a dog. And there's this feeling of knowing, so to say. It is just evident that this is a dog. And if there was someone else who lacked a certain representation, like if he, for example, didn't see the dog because he was looking in the other direction, then of course he could not understand what I'm understanding, that this is a dog. But maybe I could make him see. Maybe I could tell him, turn around, look at this dog. Or if someone did not have my concepts, if someone did not know what a dog is, if he grew up maybe in a place where there are no dogs and never heard of them, then of course seeing would not be enough because he would not have a concept of what he's seeing. I would first need to give him that concept, to explain to him what dogs are, what their attributes are, what their characteristics are. But when both is there, if someone knows what a dog is and also clearly sees a dog in front of his eyes, and still he disagrees with me and says, no, this is no dog, this is clearly a bird, I would not really know what to do, because there is a point where we cannot further make someone understand, because the communication of our understanding depends on him having the same common sense, this same click, this same feeling that, oh yeah, this concept of dog and this image I'm seeing here, they fit together. This is clearly an image of a dog. If someone didn't have that, I wouldn't really know how to help them understand what I'm understanding. Or likewise, think of a mathematical equation. Maybe someone doesn't immediately understand that your result is correct, because maybe it's a long and complex equation. Well, then maybe you could go through it with him step by step, show him that this step gives this result, and then if you add it to that, it gives this result, and if you divide it by that, and so on. But in the end, it should be evident to him that your result, if you calculate it correctly, is really the correct result. And if it's not evident to him, I mean, what can you do? If someone, if you break it down to a simple, very, very basic calculation, like if you break it down to 1 plus 1 is 2, that needs to be evident. It must just make click in your head. Yes, 1 and 1 equals 2. That just fits together. If you don't have this feeling of fitting together, if you just sit there and say, no, I don't get it, I don't see how 1 and 1 is 2, I wouldn't know how to communicate with you. I wouldn't know how to further explain it to you. So we need, in order to have cognition, we need to have this feeling that yes, all our faculties of cognition are in the right proportion. They fit together. And this feeling that, of course, we have in every specific case, this is also a general feeling because we have it in every specific case whenever we cognize something specific. And that is, Kant says, why this feeling must be something that we can communicate. I must be able to tell someone, you know, that feeling when it just makes click, when something just fits together and is evident to you. And then that other person must say, yes, of course I know that feeling. Because I too, just like you, have cognitions. I too, just like you, have knowledge, have experience. Maybe not of the same thing, but I know in general terms what it means to have experience, what it means to have knowledge. And Kant would say that exactly this feeling of the right proportion, of the fitting together of our faculties of cognition, is what brings us pleasure. Precisely because they fit together, like pieces of a puzzle, so to say. So this is what happens in beauty. The power of imagination, the intellect, they are not at war with each other, rather they play with each other. And this feeling which brings me pleasure is a feeling that everyone with whom I can communicate must share, must know, or must be able to recognize. Because if he didn't share that feeling, he would not be someone with whom I could communicate at all. If I can talk to someone and share my insights, my knowledge with someone, which is true amongst all human beings and maybe even would be true between humans and certain aliens, then it must be that we both know, so to say, what it feels like when something makes click. And that's exactly what happens when something is beautiful to us. Here it too sort of makes click. Here it makes click without a certain something making click. So it's not like we have an understanding of the thing, like we can now apply a certain concept. It's not like when I find the flower beautiful, I now know that it is a rose and not some other type of flower. But that feeling is sort of similar, or that feeling which causes me pleasure is sort of similar to when I realize, yes, this is a rose, or yes, this is a tulip. Because there I realize that my concept of rose or of tulip fits with this image. And here, when I find it beautiful, I realize that my intellect, as the faculty of concepts, of rules in general, that the regularity of my intellect in general, not a specific concept, but the conceptuality, so to say, fits with this image of the flower. And that must be something that can be communicated. That is, Kant says, why the sense pleasure, I don't expect to be able to communicate my sense pleasure. Like if I find a woman attractive, but another man is gay, I don't expect to be able to properly communicate what I find attractive here, or what it feels like to find her attractive. Or if I like a certain food, but someone else finds it disgusting, I don't expect that there can be any communication of how we perceive this food. It must taste different for us somehow. If it tasted the same for him as for me, he would have to like it too, right? So really, when biting into the same food, he must have a completely different sensation in a way. Or at least that sensation must affect him in a different way. But there's no way to communicate. We can just say, oh, okay, we seem to disagree. But when I find something beautiful, since this is based on just this right proportion, this making click between my faculties of cognition, I expect that this pleasure I'm feeling here is something I can communicate to everyone with whom I can communicate at all. I expect that when I say, this is beautiful to me, he not only knows what that feeling is of beauty, but also he will necessarily agree that to him this same thing is beautiful. Because his faculties of cognition, when viewing that thing, must also be in the same wide proportion to, so to say, click with one another. And taste to Kant. Of course, I speak here of the taste of reflection, so the taste for the beautiful, not of the sense taste for food. Taste for Kant is nothing but the ability of the reflecting power of judgment to judge a priori about a kind of pleasure being able to be communicated. Taste, I have taste when I find pleasure in viewing something, and I can judge without having to first ask other people if they also find pleasure in that. But if I can judge a priori that they will also find pleasure in this, then I have taste. And of course, this pleasure or this feeling cannot be explained through a concept, Kant says, that is through a rule of the intellect. We don't have a rule that we are conscious of here. It is as if it does follow a rule, but a rule that we don't know, at least not consciously, once again. I mean, if I had a clear rule for what is beautiful and what isn't, then I could explain by that rule why something is beautiful and some other thing is not beautiful, because one thing meets this rule and the other doesn't. And also, if I had such a rule, then I could produce something beautiful. I could be sure to produce something beautiful. Art would then be just like constructing a machine when you know how the machine works. You would just have to follow that rule and could be sure that you would produce something beautiful which will be liked by everyone. But of course, that is not the case. So Kant says the beautiful kind of follows a rule that we all share without knowing it. So that means that the specific beautiful object is never itself the rule. It is just exemplary. It is an example of something which follows this unknown rule. So basically, when I point at something and tell others that this thing here, this flower, for example, is beautiful, what I am sort of saying is, you all know this feeling of your faculties of cognition being in the right proportion. I know that you all know this feeling, because otherwise I could not talk to you otherwise I could not communicate with you about our knowledge at all. You all know this feeling that you have when you understand something, when your sensuality and your intellect fit together and it makes click between them. Well, look at this thing now, this flower, for example. When I look at this thing, without understanding what it is, I have this feeling that we also have in understanding. And I am sure, even without having asked you, I am sure that you must have the same feeling when looking at this thing. That is what we mean by calling a thing beautiful. But it is also the reason why there can be disagreement about the beautiful. Because we don't know the actual rule that, so to say, all beautiful things follow. And we cannot name the rule itself. We cannot conceptualize the rule. All we can do is give examples for things that, in our opinion, follow that rule. And that is why always someone else can disagree and say, no, this is a bad example. I know what you're talking about. I know what beauty is. I know how that wide proportion of my faculties of cognition feels like. But the example you give me doesn't make me feel that way. Another example would be better. With this, Kant has answered the question that he asked in the critique of the power of judgment. The general question of all three critiques is, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? I made a lecture about that already. So Kant is asking, how is it possible that we can judge a priori, so without experience, just from our thinking faculty alone, and that the judgment we are making is not just analytic, it's not just explaining something and bringing more clarity into something which we already know, but rather, how is it possible that that a priori judgment somehow extends our knowledge in a way? That is the general question of all the critiques. And as I explained in that lecture on that general question, that question can now be divided into three questions. How are synthetic judgments a priori possible that are logical judgments, so judgments on cognition, on truth? How are aesthetical synthetic judgments a priori possible, so judgments on pleasure or displeasure? And how are practical, that is, judgments on what we should or shouldn't do, judgments on action? How are practical synthetic judgments a priori possible? And well, here we find that the answer to the second question is, unsurprisingly, quite similar to the answer to the first question. So logical and aesthetical synthetic judgments a priori are possible for somewhat similar reasons. In the critique of pure reason, Kant showed that we have certain concepts. Our intellect has certain concepts. And in the critique of the power of judgment, he shows that we have a certain pleasure when it comes to the beautiful. Now, of course, there's a difference in that in the critique of pure reason, the very concepts are already concepts we have a priori, the 12 categories of our intellect, which don't come out of experience, but out of the intellect. While here, when it comes to this feeling of pleasure that we call beauty, as a feeling, we have it only a posteriori. But either way, we have these concepts, we have this feeling, and now we make synthetic judgments with them. So I have the concept, for example, of causality, and I make the judgment that this is not just a concept I happen to have, but rather this is the basis of a principle of nature. everything that happens in nature must happen because it was caused by a cause. And likewise, here now I have this pleasure when, for example, looking at a flower, and I make the judgment that it's not just my pleasure, my private pleasure that I happen to have, but every being which is like me, sensual and intellectual, every being with whom I can communicate on some level, when looking here, must feel that same pleasure. And these synthetic judgments, which are judgments a priori, they are possible in both cases because I'm relating my judgment to viewing or intuition. Because I have these two forms of viewing about whom I talked in the lecture on sensuality and the forms of viewing, I have time and space, which too come not from experience, but are my forms of viewing through which I necessarily view whatever I happen to view. And in these forms of viewing, because I can say a priori, whatever I view and whatever another being, another human who is like me views, will be viewed in this way. That is why I can make synthetic judgments a priori. That is why I can say, well, whatever I can view must conform to these concepts of mine. And that is why I can say, well, this pleasure that I get out of simply viewing, that I get out of contemplating the form something has in time and space, while being completely disinterested, because the interest I maybe don't share with other beings, but this viewing in time and space I share with every human being. And so that pleasure I get from disinterestedly contemplating a form and finding that the form is so harmonious, so purposiveness, that it just fits perfectly for my faculty of cognition, which again I share with every human being. That is what allows me to make this synthetic judgment a priori, that what I find beautiful, anyone, universally and with necessity, should find beautiful if he too looks at it and contemplates it without any interest. Because that is, of course, always the condition, and since that condition is rarely or maybe never met, that is the only reason why we disagree on what is beautiful. And so that is Kant's theory of beauty. That is these four very specific moments of the judgment on something being beautiful. So when I judge something to be beautiful, the quantity of that judgment is universal. The quality is, it is a disinterested judgment. The relation is that the thing is purposive in its form, but not for some object, but rather for me as a subject, for my faculty of cognition. And the modality is that pleasure I'm feeling is necessary. That is what beauty is, according to Kant. My deep thanks be to my supporters, Thomas Deuringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.